Dead Ends, written by Jonathan Dunne, narrated for you by the author. Dead Ends 4. The Dare. Norman Childers spotted them through the bare trees. At first he hadn't seen them when he looked out his living room window at the park below. If it wasn't for the silvery light thrown by the full moon, coupled with the park lighting, he wouldn't have seen the group huddled around one of the picnic tables by the frozen lake. It was the middle of winter, and that also played a hand in revealing the nocturnal picnickers through the naked horse chestnuts. Childers questioned who they were and what they were up to. He deduced that they were teenagers smoking the devil's lettuce. He checked his wristwatch to see that it was 3:34 in the morning. Something felt off. It was a school night, and it was freezing out there. If it was a weekend or a sultry summer night when all the kids were on holiday, then Childers might have said it was pretty normal to see them out there in the park, enjoying their youth. But it was an icy December Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. He couldn't think of any earthly reason why they would be there when he had never seen them on any other night, especially when he was suffering from writer's block like he was tonight. But the problem was that Norman Childers was looking for an earthly reason when he should have been looking for an unearthly one. "There isn't another soul down there," Norman said to Russ, his Jack Russell, sniffing and licking his bare feet. Later on this very night, he would be reminded of this line. "Maybe it's you that's a little off," Norman said to himself. "Perhaps you've got too much time on your hands, bud. A grown man looking out his window in the middle of the night. Maybe you are the one with the issue, not the people over there in the park. Russ, what say you?" The little dog was more concerned with Norman's toes. It wasn't as if the writer was a nosy old man whose body clock had gone haywire. He was a 48-year-old suspense author with a looming deadline for his next novel. At the rate he was going, it wouldn't make a suspense novella, maybe a short story. And the only suspense right now was that strange group sitting at the picnic table in the park across the street in the middle of this freezing night. Childers never believed in writer's block, preferring to side with the idea that writer's block was only an acute symptom of a distracted or lazy writer. But, to his dismay, he discovered that writer's block was indeed a genuine phenomenon, and he was experiencing it right now and had been for the last 7 nights in a row. His imagination was nothing but a desert, with no promise of an oasis. Childers had been staring at a blank page on his MacBook screen as if he had never written a shopping list in his life, never mind a dozen bestsellers. The truth was that he hadn't even begun to write his book. He had no idea how it was supposed to start. This is why the author was looking out his window tonight, searching for inspiration that could spark an idea, inject a little suspense into his boring life, and... Wait, he paused. This is it. He looked about him with a great sense of awe and wonder. It's staring me in the face. Whoever said the world works in mysterious ways was right. Was this the suspense he was looking for? Okay, maybe I'm reaching, but the seed of something is here. Norman persuaded himself because this was as good as it was going to get. The author could start his novel with an insomniac character who just happens to be a writer, who happens to be peering out his living room window right now in the middle of a chilly night, looking for inspiration for his next book, when he spots a strange group of individuals in the park. God, if you're tuning in right now, thank you for your mysterious ways. Childers rejoiced. But wait, what happens next? Norman Childers sat on the windowsill for another 20 minutes, spying on the group at the picnic table, whilst he waited for divine hope to deliver the rest of his suspense thriller's plot to him. But the author was only too well aware he wouldn't find anything divine in his living room. He had to create his hope. You need to go down there, Norm. That's what you need to do. Write what you know, isn't that the expression, Russ? Russ was snoring in his tatty basket by the TV. With growing excitement, Childers realized he had his complete novel right here tonight, but to find out what happened next, he just had to go down there. On second thoughts, maybe going down there was dangerous. Norman didn't know who these people were, but make no mistake, he needed to get a closer look at these individuals without getting closer. That seemed like an impossible task until he remembered his binoculars hanging in his wardrobe. The writer had never used them much after buying them, just hung them up and forgot about them. They were a Christmas present to himself a few years back. He liked the idea of people watching from his living room window until he felt he was stalking and spying on passers-by. He left the window and went to fetch the binoculars bag hanging in his bedroom wardrobe, then took up his position at the living room window again. The author raised the eyepieces to his eyes and held his breath as he zoomed into that picnic table. Childers counted 4 people sitting at the picnic area, 2 of them with their backs to him and 2 more sitting on the other side of the table. Their faces were not visible to him as they had their heads bowed, focusing on something on the table. And that was when the wordsmith felt the first flutter inside him. Childers couldn't be sure, but it seemed as if the foursome hadn't moved an inch since he first spotted them, and that had to be almost an hour ago by now. 4 statues sitting there in the dancing, spindly shadows thrown by the branches of the bare trees around them. Then again, there was some distance between his building and the park across the street. It was impossible to discern much movement, but whatever they were focusing on had all their attention. Childers considered they were viewing their phones, perhaps all 4 playing some online video game, yet their body language was switched off. The author debated whether to go down there, but the looming deadline for his next thriller told him he had no choice but to go down there and get a closer look. After all, now he had a gripping introduction to his latest suspense novel. Yes, it needed tweaking, but he had the seed for an influential book. But that book needs to germinate and grow, he told himself. He pulled on his puffy coat and woolly hat and was about to leave when he had second thoughts. He was too tired. Childers would wait until tomorrow night, when he would be more ready for them. Besides, he was barefoot. "Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you?" he said, looking down at his feet. He took off his coat and hat and threw them on the coat perch by the door. But as he drew the curtains on his view of the park across the street, it dawned on him that he could very well be drawing the curtains on his next book. It would be curtains for him too. It wasn't as if he could retire any time soon. His books were hardly covering his bills, and he always needed to write just one more book. Who was he kidding? Sleep was the last thing on his agenda now. If Childers went to bed now, he would only stare at the ceiling, wondering what the foursome across in the park was up to. He would have given anything just to see one of them move, never mind anything else. For the second time that night, Norman Childers put on his coat and woolly hat and pulled on his socks and boots this time. He was about to leave the flat when he looked over his shoulder. The Jack Russell was very cozy, curled up in his basket, but the dog loved a walk in the park, and Russ would provide much-needed company. "Russ, walkies!" The little dog raised his head on cue, then looked about. Had he heard the magic word? "Come on, Russ. Yes, you heard right. Let's go for walkies." He skipped out of his basket and wagged his stump of a tail. Childers loved how his dog was always ready for a walk, no matter what time of day or night. Once the Jack Russell heard "walkies," time no longer had meaning for the canine. It was time to find out what happened next in this novel of his. Suspense author Norman Childers descended the stairwell with his Jack Russell Russ on a tight leash. There was a lift in the building, but the writer suffered from claustrophobia, and his dog didn't appreciate the lurching lift either. But what the writer suffered more was a mild dose of misanthropy. Having to make inane small talk with the neighbours was the worst kind of claustrophobia. He stepped outside the Georgian townhouse. The freezing air was so bitter it made his eyes water. As he carefully picked his way down the icy steps to the street, he realized just how wintry it was tonight. He hadn't appreciated it when he was upstairs, looking through his window from his warm flat. But now, feeling the bite in the air caused even more consternation for Childers. Those 4 individuals were sitting over there in the park as if it was a mild night. He crossed Limerick City's O'Connell Street. The author loved, to walk through the city at night when and where it differed from the daytime. Everything that looked familiar during the day took on a different shade at night. The author had a propensity for gazing up at the lit windows of the buildings as he walked by below, wondering about the people who lived inside those windows. Each window seemed like a different world to Childers at night, and he imagined what it was like to look out at O'Connell Street from those windows. He lived on the same street, but he imagined a strange version of the city he had come to know. It was like looking at a reverse image of the city in an enormous mirror. During the nocturnal hours, the writer became a stranger in the city. Or maybe the city became a stranger to him. He crossed over to the park, walked through the main gates and continued along the pathway, casting a cautious glance over his shoulder. Childer's breath fogged out before him in steamy puffs. Russ bounced along by his feet, stopping every few steps to take a sniff. Not a sound or soul could be found in the city park. The full moon illuminated the frozen surface of the small but deep lake, making it glitter. A magical, surreal quality enveloped the entire scene. But looks can be deceiving. In the furthest corner of the lake, out of view from the public, was a fresh, jagged hole in the ice. Many urban legends surrounded the lake, some legends stemming from true stories more horrifying than the urban legends they spawned. Childers was a local expert on the lake and its sinister history. Being a suspense author, he found the lake to be fascinating in a ghoulish way. It had taken lives down through the years. No, it was more than that. It had taken lives at very strategic moments with an eerie pattern and deadly accuracy. The author would like to pen a book on the history of the ominous lake one day. But for now, he had enough with his suspense novel. He already had the first few chapters of the book, and it would play out just as this surreal night was playing out. It would go something like this. Norman's main character is a suspense novelist, desperately trying to break out of his creative dry spell. To stir the creative juices, he goes for a nighttime stroll in the city he loves. He comes across 4 individuals in the local park playing some kind of mysterious game by the light of the moon. And that's as far as Childers had got. To find out what happened next, he needed to get closer. The author tensed as he approached the picnic area. They were sitting there just as he had seen them through his living room window. But now that he was closer, he began to question if they had been as statuesque as he had first thought. The ethereal illumination coming from the full moon, coupled with the skeletal branch shadows, might have created the illusion of that eerie stillness. Childers became aware of his surroundings and how abandoned the park was tonight, how nobody would ever know if anything should happen to him now. He lived alone and didn't have regular visitors. He would disappear and nobody would ever... "Stop," he whispered to himself. He was about to turn back when he convinced himself to go on, finding inspiration in the knowing that the events of tonight could make or break his future. Norman Childers wasn't to know just how true this would turn out to be. He held his breath as he approached the picnic table, listening out for voices, but it was difficult to hear anything as the steady breeze blew through the overhead branches. Childers would have liked to hear voices, even if those voices were threatening towards him. He didn't care, but the unnerving silence coming from that picnic table was far more frightening than anything any voice could say to him. The wordsmith let on that he hadn't seen them, but walked on by, one eye on the pathway ahead and the other eye on the late-night congregation. As he passed by them, they didn't acknowledge him. They sat there in that discouraging silence. Childers saw how there were young people, 2 girls and 2 boys by the looks of things. From this distance he guessed they were about 18 years old, and that silence unnerved him even more. He'd never known teenagers to remain so quiet. As he passed by the picnic table, the only sound he heard was his footsteps. The Jack Russell skipped right by them, unaware of their existence. The author kept walking, casting furtive glances over his shoulder, half afraid one of those statues might come gunning in his direction. He intended to walk around the lake and head back home, but his curiosity wouldn't let him. Norman needed to know what they were up to. Throwing caution to the wind, he turned and headed back the way he came. As he approached their location, he questioned whether he should tiptoe or make his presence known. The novelist decided this time he would spy on them. It would be an interesting angle for his novel. He doubled back. Lithely on his feet, he kept to the tree line, hiding behind the thick trunks of the horse chestnuts. Within minutes, Childers had sneaked up on the group, his safety coming second place to satisfying his curiosity. A minute later, he was right behind them. Jesus in heaven, but that silence was so creepy his skin prickled. It looked as if they were playing some type of board game, perhaps chess, which was unusual considering video games like Five Nights at Freddy's were all the rage. The sound of clinking glass filtered into his hearing range. Without warning, Russ decided he no longer wanted to play hide-and-seek with his master, and the little dog left Norman's side and skipped right up to the group. Childers cursed the canine under his breath. He watched how the Jack Russell sniffed about the picnic. Then, oh no, pissed onto one of the boy's feet. He drew his hand to his mouth in astonishment. This behaviour was so unlike Russ. It was the first time he'd ever seen him doing that, and it shocked him. The dog just cocked his leg as if he had stopped at one of his favourite spots to mark his territory. Childers concluded this meant one of two things. Either the dog had not seen the young man, or he had a strange effect on the Jack Russell. He was about to chastise the dog and apologise when he realised he was supposed to be in hiding. But now a greater reason for keeping quiet was coming to the fore, and that was the succinct fact that the teenager didn't react to the warm gush of canine urine. Even stranger, none of the four people acknowledged the dog, too concentrated on something Norman couldn't see from his vantage point. Ever so slowly, the author came out from behind the horse-chestnut tree and walked towards them. It was impossible now that they wouldn't hear or see him as he stepped through the crinkling carpet of frozen dead leaves. There wasn't a cloud in the night sky, and the white full moon shone down on the four picnickers. Only there was no picnic, but a game. Childers stepped right up to the table. The foursome didn't acknowledge him. As frozen as the lake surface they sat by, expressionless, black and white faces. Now he could see that the clinking glass he'd heard earlier was a spinning bottle, glinting in the moonlight as it spun at high speed. The whirling bottle was placed in the middle of the circle of scrunched-up pieces of paper. They were playing a game the writer used to play when he was a kid, with the generic title Spin the Bottle. And those little balls of paper could contain anything. Perhaps he'd stumbled upon a nocturnal kissing party game, but there was no reassuring giggle or silly laughter that might accompany such a game. And that bottle kept spinning. No, wait, thought Childers. Maybe they're playing a game of truth or dare. Just when the writer noticed how the bottle kept spinning, it stopped dead, pointing straight at him. The four oddly monochromatic faces turned to look up at him from the pointing bottle. The light was poor, but Childers could tell that there was something wrong with these people. As their hollow eyes and vacant expressions took him in, he thought that maybe they were ill, all four sharing the same vacant symptoms. Then he considered the possibility of drug use. He might have taken a puff or two of the devil's lettuce when he was younger, but no plant from the ground could ever have this unnerving effect. One of the two girls shifted, reminding him of an automaton coming to life. She reached over and picked up one ball of paper and handed it to the scribe. No words passed between them. Childers gulped as she placed the paper in his hand, a piece of paper he never asked for. Their fingers touched, and that was the moment the writer realized was something wrong tonight. His fingers were so cold that they had become numb, but Norman noticed that the girl's fingers were sticks of ice. Not only that, her skin had the texture of melting ice. The other girl and two boys looked just the same, sharing that same bluish tinge and glistening in the moonlight. Norman considered the ball of paper in his hand and noticed how it was soggy. Not sure what to do with it, he looked at them for guidance. They waited as if Childers knew what he had to do next because he was starring in his own novel. After all, he had already written the book, even the dramatic conclusion. He just didn't know it yet. Following his gut instinct, he unfolded the ball of paper. In the low light, he could make out a childish scribble in pencil. And that was something else that got under his skin. The writing was penned by a young child, or an adult who couldn't write very well, or someone forgetting how to write. He squinted to get a closer look, not sure if he'd read the words correctly. Childers got his phone out and switched on his flashlight. Walk across the lake. With a flutter of nerves, Norman Childers looked at the four people. In the few seconds it had taken to read the message, they had deteriorated even more. A horrible realization bubbled deep inside the author, but for the love of Christ and all that was good in the world, the author refused to take the lid off that simmering pot. These kids were playing a game of truth or dare, at least their version of it. And they had just dared him to walk across the frozen lake, yet something was bubbling inside him all right, but it wasn't coming from the simmering pot, but the bottom of that death-trap lake. Childers had even written a letter to the city council asking for a barrier to be set up around the lake. Something else was dawning on the author, and the more he thought about it, the more lightheaded and nauseous he felt. No! He shook his head. He needed to do some quick thinking here. What would the Norman Childers of his suspense novel do? He would be cunning and turn this nightmare around. Yes, okay, his voice quavered. I would like to play truth or dare with you, but I prefer the truth option, if that's okay. It would be funny in another lifetime. What would you like to know? Ask me anything, please. With increasing desperation, he looked down at Russ, looking up at him with an inquisitive face and beady, glistening eyes. It was strange, but at that moment he realized Russ was only a 6-year-old Jack Russell, and not the extended part of him and best friend he'd always taken the canine to be. Correction, he was the dog's best friend, but the dog was anyone's best friend if they fed him. Russ wouldn't be getting him out of this sticky situation because he was just a dog. An acute sense of loneliness struck Childers. With zero expression, the same sweet-faced girl, now with bluish veins spider-webbing on her face, reached down and picked up another ball of paper, then handed it to him. Feeling somewhat relieved, Childers unfolded the mushy paper and shone his light on it. His inside surged, as if he'd just jumped out of a plane. Walk across the lake. The same dare was pinned on this piece of paper, nothing more than a messy blot. He dropped it to the ground, shaking his head. The writer picked up the third ball of paper from the table, unfolded it, and shone his phone flashlight to read, Walk across the lake. With frozen, jittery hands, he clumsily went from ball of paper to ball of paper, right around the circle of scrunched-up papers, 15 in all, his heart twanging harder as he uncurled each paper ball to read the same unequivocal dare. Walk across the lake. Childers took a step away, and without turning his back to them, reversed to the public path, hoping to God to meet a passer-by who had taken a night stroll. As he backpedaled through the bed of leaves, the force suddenly spasmed into life and came barreling towards him. Before the scribe knew what was happening, they had surrounded him. With each step they took towards him, they visibly worsened until they were nothing but animated, bloated corpses. They cornered the author and gave him no choice but to step back towards the lake. Russ! He called. Russ! The Jack Russell jumped around, yapping incessantly at Childers. At Childers, not the ghosts. The author was sure the dog couldn't see them, and hadn't seen them when he lifted his leg to urinate earlier. Russ was barking because the dog thought Norman was playing with him, and for a surreal moment, Childers was watching himself and imagining how he must have seemed, backing away, arms raised at nothing. Why, yes, of course, Russ wanted to play. He often came down to the park during the milder weather to throw the Jack Russell a frisbee, and the dog was waiting for the flying disc to appear from somewhere right now. Childers tried to make a run for it by breaking through them, but his fingers and hands sunk into their gelatinous, icy bodies. Frog spawn, he thought. The midnight revelers just felt like the icy jelly frog spawn he used to collect from the local pond in Sheehan's Field when he was a boy, and watched how those tadpoles mutated, grew limbs, and lost tails. He spasmed away and looked over his shoulder at the twinkling, moonlit lake. They edged him onto the cracking ice. His boots slipped and slid on the slippery surface. The barking Jack Russell placed his 2 paws on the ice and very warily took more tentative steps onto the frozen lake. No sooner had the canine all 4 paws on the freezing ice when his instinct told him to turn back. The little dog watched as his master slipped, flailed and roared at nothing in front of him as he backed right out into the centre of the lake. Childers screamed for help, but nobody came. The 4 dead children came bearing down on the author. He tried to escape their sticky clutches, preferring to take his chances and keep moving backwards rather than forwards into that jelly-like, eye-bulging nightmare. Their eyes swelled and popped from their sockets. The writer saw how they moved with jaw-dropping ease across the icy surface. A splintering crack split the lake in 2. "Russ!" uttered Norman Childers before dropping through the ice. Gasping and spluttering, he scrambled to get back out, but the iced corset squeezed the breath from him as he sunk into the ice-cold waters. He witnessed the infinitely disturbing image of the 4 teenagers slipping into another hole like slithering eels. To Childers' horror, he realized they had made that ice-barbed hole on their way out of the lake, whereas he just made a hole on his way into the lake. 4 shapes circled him once before dropping into the murky waters, as if they had rocks tied to their rotting feet. Childers hopelessly tried to grasp the edge of the hole, but his fingers were numb and no longer felt a part of him. As hypothermia set in, Norman had the false sensation that his body was warming up. A strange clarity came to him. As the freezing water flooded into Childers' lungs, he recalled why he had petitioned to have the lake fenced off. The nasty urban legend swirled around this lake, how every 23 years a passerby minding their own business would somehow end up at the bottom of this lake. And it wasn't just a legend. The last tragedy was in December 2000, on a night just like this one, when 4 harmless kids crossed the lake at night for some ungodly reason. Their deaths were ruled an accident when the ice cracked beneath their feet, drowning the 4 of them. The police looked for signs of foul play in the picnic area by the lake. They came up with nothing except a worn green glass bottle and a bunch of balled-up papers with the same scrawled words. Walk across the lake. It was a dare game gone wrong, opened and shut case, but funnily enough, and there wasn't anything funny about it, back in 1977, a similar fatality happened to a woman who had decided to walk out into the frozen lake in the middle of the night and fall through the layer of ice. What had taken her out there? She had been on her own. Just like similar fatalities every 23 years since 1870, there was no plausible reason why she would take her life in her own hands, and even less reason to take her life. Again, no foul play. But they found an old chipped green glass bottle and a circle of scrunched papers with a scribbled dare on a picnic table with a view of the lake. Walk across the lake. And just as quickly as that moment of clarity had come upon the author, he grew confused as he was quickly overcome by that crushing ice corset and succumbed to the elements. As he lost his grip on the ice and the world as he knew it, Norman Childers' last conscious thought was that he had found the ending of his novel. It was New Year's Eve when James and Maria met up in the local park to get out of their hectic houses and share a kiss before 2047 was upon them. It was a promise they'd made to themselves. The 19-year-olds wanted to share their first kiss and make it official. That way, when they were old, they would tell their grandchildren how they had been together since way back in 2046. Only they wouldn't get the opportunity to meet their grandchildren. As they approached their favourite picnic table where they liked to come when the sun went down, they noticed a man sitting at their table. He said nothing, just sat there, staring at a spinning green glass bottle on the picnic table before him. They noticed a ring of scrunched up balls of paper encircling that forever revolving bottle. The strange individual, silent and wan, gazed up at them with dark unblinking eyes as the bottle came to a sudden stop, pointing right at them. The midnight stranger handed the girl a ball of soggy paper. She unfolded the piece of paper and squinted at the careless scrawl. In a hushed voice, she read, "Walk across